conducting this interview from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This festival also would not at all be possible without the support of our funders, and I just want to take a moment to express our sincere gratitude to Saskatchewan's Art Board, Sask Culture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of Canada, the City of Moose Jaw, as well as a long list of project and event sponsors and funders. My name is Anthony Bidulka, and I'll be one of the featured authors at Saskatchewan Festival of Words later this summer. But right now, I'm very happy to be here talking with Linwood Barclay. Now, to share with you just a little taste of Linwood's outstanding career, I can tell you that Linwood is a New York Times best-selling author. He has authored what they tell me is 20 previous novels and 2 thrillers for children, but by my count, I think it's more than that, but we can talk about that in a bit. His books have been translated into more than 24 languages. He wrote the screenplay adaptation for his novel Never Saw It Coming, and his book, The Accident, has been made into a TV series in France. And I just finished reading Find You First, and I can tell you that that's another book that I think would make an excellent movie. His novel, No Time for Goodbye, was a global bestseller. He's a native of Connecticut, but he lives in Toronto now with his wife, Neetha. Linwood, welcome to Saskatchewan.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It's really a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Yes, and I'm glad that you're here because I know this is a big week for you. You have just released your brand new book, Take Your Breath Away, across North America. Except I did hear some rumblings that there was a couple of copies found in a Shoppers Drug Mart last week.
That's right. I was in Belleville, in Ontario. Not far from our place, we have in Prince Edward County, and I went in and I was walking past the Shoppers, and they had a book they had books right by the window, and I something caught my eye and looked and I went, well, it's out in the wild. It's out already. So I think that was 4 days before the official release date that Shoppers Drug Mart had it. So I thought, this is great. You can go in, you can get a book, you can get Band-Aids, you can get anything you need. You get some shampoo.
All those things you need with a Linwood Barclay book is some Band-Aids, maybe some licorice, that kind of stuff. All good. Now, back to the number of books that you've written. I know that you wrote a few nonfiction, I think it was like mid-1990s, late 1990s. And then, so excluding those and excluding your short stories and novellas, I count more like 25. Like, I think this is your number 25. Does that sound right to you?
It might be right. If we count the two thrillers I wrote for young readers, and I think this book is it's the 20 of the adult annual sort of thrillers. I think this is book 21. I should hold on. I even have one here. Just by coinkydink. This is the one. This came out on day before yesterday. I think it's the 21st. I could eat up the half of the time counting them up. But I also wrote. Actually, I have on the shelf here. I wrote a memoir that came out 22 years ago called Last Resort, which is a book I'm quite proud of, but it often doesn't get counted. So yeah, we're somewhere around. And I wrote 2 short books of political satire, both about Ontario premiers. One about a book called Mike Harris Made Me Eat My Dog, and more recently, a book about Doug Ford called Ford Abomination, which I should have waited to do much later because I did it early. Did it 2 years ago before the COVID stuff. I should have just waited, But anyway, what can I say?
So you're well into the 20s, and actually, there's one more. Like you're releasing another book in 2022. Is that right?
That's correct. So there'll be another book this year, and in fact, I have written next year's regular release is written. There will be a second novel coming out near the end of October called Look Both Ways, and it's kind of an extra. And we're sort of selling it as promoting it as an extra, because it's not the kind of book I typically write It's more of what I would call a kind of a Michael Crichton kind of a thriller. It's, in fact, I describe it as think Jurassic Park, but instead of dinosaurs, it's self-driving cars. And it takes place on a Martha's Vineyard kind of island community where a big Tesla type company is doing an ultimate test with autonomous vehicles. And the best way to test them is if every single car on the road is one, because they're like of a hive mind. They all know where each other are. They never have accidents. And so the islanders agree to be part of an experiment where they surrender all of their cars to the mainland, and everybody's given one of these little jelly bean kind of cars. And on the day of the big media, festivities for all of this, a virus gets introduced into the system, and all the cars essentially become homicidal. And it's like being on an island with 1,000 Christines. And so that's not the kind of book I typically write. But I wrote it. I must have written it more than 3 years ago. And my publishers have all since then and said, "We love this book. We don't know what to do with it because it's not what you usually do."
Yeah.
But I think if you like my other stuff, it's all it's a page turner. There's some surprises. There's some twists. It's good fun.
Do you mind just sort of sharing quickly the tie to your dad?
Yeah. So I wrote a foreword for this book to sort of explain why I was doing something different, and talked about the fact that when I was growing up, I've always loved cars. I just adore cars. I love cars. But when I was growing up, I was surrounded by automotive imagery because my father was an automotive illustrator, a commercial artist who worked in advertising. And throughout the 50s and early 60s, if you were to look at all the big magazines, Life, Look, Saturday Evening Post, all the car ads were illustrations and not photography. And my dad drew those cars. And I'm thrilled that my publishers wanted, I just grabbed this because we were talking about, my publishers wanted, we had decided to run one of my father's illustrations on the title page of the book when it comes out, because there's one car on the island that didn't get taken to the mainland, that has been sort of tucked away in a garage. And it's a car that looks exactly like this.
Yeah.
And this is
everybody like that is a rendering. That's not a photograph.
That is not a photograph. That is an illustration that my father, an original that my father did with an airbrush and pen and ink and so forth, of a 1959 Cadillac.
That's
and a 1959 Cadillac plays an important role in my novel Look Both Ways. So there's a little teaser for what's coming.
Yeah. So that's called Look Both Ways.
Yes.
But the book that we're celebrating this week is Take Your Breath Away. So let's talk a little bit about that.
This is for anyone who has 3D on their screen. This is
the technology you have access to, Linwood. It's just
so the book is Take Your Breath Away. That's
in honor of your 2019 book, Elevator Pitch. Would you mind giving all of us just a quick elevator pitch about this book?
So this is about a guy named Andrew who 6 years ago was off on a fishing trip for the weekend with his friend, and when he came home, his wife Bree was not there. And 6 years have gone by; she's never been found, and the police have always figured that Andrew had something to do with it. He could have come back in the night from his fishing trip, or maybe he hired somebody or whatever, but they've never been able to convict him or to nail him for this. And maybe they're wrong, maybe they're right. And so Andrew's gone through some tough period. He's changed his last name. He's moved from where he used to live, sold that house. In fact, after he moved, the new owners raised the house, they leveled it, and they built a whole new house on that lot. And he's went through a tough period. He was drinking a lot, but 6 years later, he's kind of getting his life back together. And he's found this has a new lady in his life. And one morning he gets a call. And at his old address, a woman pulled into the driveway, loaded groceries in the back of the car, as if she had just gone out to run a bit of errands and came back. And she gets out of the car and she looks and she says, "Where's my house? What has happened to my house?" The house that she expected to see there is not there. It's gone. And one of the neighbors looks over and thinks, "That looks an awful lot like the woman who used to live there who went missing. And so if it's her, where's she been for 6 years? And how could she come back and act as if she's been gone an hour? And if it's not her, then what the hell is going on? Yeah. And so Andrew's life is about to get particularly complicated, very, very complicated again. So that's a long kind of elevator pitch, but that is our setup for.
Yeah, all of that happens very quickly at the beginning of the novel. So
Yeah.
that's your first bit of taking your breath away. I know, Linwood, that you've talked a lot about hoping that every year you can find that, that one great what if moment or a juicy newspaper story that gives you that seed for a new book. I know even with when I was reading Find You First, I mean, I was thinking, about Jeffrey Epstein and about, all these fertility doctors who've fathered all these children. Without spoiling the book, can you tell us, was there a what if moment for this book or something in the news, or did it come from something completely different?
What it came from is there was, I had an idea for a scene. And I think that idea came to me more than 3 years ago. And it was that scene of a woman coming to her house with a trunk load of groceries and saying, "Where's my house? What's happened to my house?" And I thought, that's so cool. How could a house disappear and a new house be built? And I thought it was such a great scene, and I could not figure out what happened. I just thought, well, what set of circumstances brought us to this point? And so, a year and a half ago or whenever, when I thought, well, this will be my next book, I thought, I'm going to have to figure out what happened. Yeah. And so I sat down with a pen and paper, and I just started jotting down ideas of what are 10 possible explanations for this. And, I threw out alien abduction rather quickly. And I finally settled on something that I thought worked. And once I had it nailed down in my head what it was, then I was able to write that book. But
why don't you just tell us right now?
Pardon?
Why don't you just tell us right now?
Yeah, you can save yourself a fortune. You don't have to buy this. You could just, and so that story wasn't inspired by anything. It was just this idea that came to my head, this sort of scene, and so but it took me a while. That one had to kind of percolate for a while before I could figure it out.
Yeah, and it sounded like you had to work on it a bit. Now, I could imagine that, as you're keeping your mind open for the what ifs or these stories that would inspire you, I'm sure there's some years where you have a hard time finding one, and there's probably other years where you're constantly thought, oh yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Do you keep a what if file of ideas that you might want to visit at some point?
No, I don't. Yeah. I just kind of keep open to just, and thing is, and if I actually sit down and think what would be a really good idea, nothing will come. I have to just not think at all about anything, and then suddenly just something's floating around in the ether and it just hits me. I think, well, that's kind of neat. And I just come from the strangest places, and like when you mentioned, I did a book a couple years ago called Elevator Pitch, which was about a very different kind of serial killer who was killing people by sabotaging elevators randomly throughout Manhattan. And that idea came because I was listening to CBC News, and they were talking about all of these massive condo towers that were going up by the waterfront. And they said they didn't have enough elevator inspectors to keep up with the pace of construction. There hadn't been a problem, but they just were short of elevator inspectors. And the idea was just there, just like that. What if you had a guy who killed people by sabotaging elevators?
Yeah.
And it seemed to me almost too out there. Like it was just too outlandish an idea. And I was talking to my agent like later that day, and I said, "Oh, and I had this idea." And she said, "Oh my God, you have to start writing that tonight." And so I was actually finishing up another book at the time, A Noise Downstairs. So I thought, okay, that'll be the next one.
Yeah. Now, I noticed when I was reading this book that, starting pretty early, you have, throwaway lines that make some reference to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming, I might be wrong, but I'm assuming that some, if not all, of this book was written during the pandemic. And it's a thing with writers for us to consider whether we should integrate major world events like 9/11, like a pandemic, into our writing, especially if it's happening in the same time period.
Yeah.
What was your thought process with that?
Well, most of my books I write as if they were set at the time I was writing them, or around that time. I don't write historical stuff. I kind of key in on what's current. And a lot of us have sort of thought, well, maybe we should just set every book going forward now in 2019. It would be just easier. And in fact, Stephen King was talking about this in an event, because his novel Billy Summer, which he was setting in 2020, and there was a plot element that involved sending somebody on a cruise. And as he was writing, I thought, well, that's not going to work, because they've all been shut down. So he moved the book's time period back a year, back to 2018, 2019. But I thought, to ignore it, I mean, that would be like if you were to write a book in 1951 and pretend World War II didn't happen. I mean, the pandemic was a major global, international, historic event. And so it's just, and the book's not about the pandemic, but it's referenced. Our hero has got, old gloves and masks tucked in next to the seat, and laying in there, down by the carpet and stuff. So it's there, it happened. And in fact, the book that I've written for next year, there's an element of the pandemic that plays an important part. The book's not about it, but it's related.
Oh, interesting. So then is that something that when someone's reading that book in 10 years, they'll have to place it in 2022?
Sure. That'll be the time period that when it happened. But
Yeah.
that doesn't trouble. That's fine with me. I mean, there's lots of, I know some writers. I know Mark Billingham deliberately kind of obscures any reference to time or when it happened, so that we don't have this sort of, well, the book will come out and people say, well, didn't you know that this happened? And it doesn't. He just doesn't mention the year or anything. But and I did put a note at the end of Take Your Breath Away that this book's coming out in 2022. It treats the pandemic as if it is basically over. And but as I write this comment in the book, I don't know that it will be, but I was having a moment of sort of uncharacteristic optimism, and so I think it still works, because we're still dealing with it, but I think our lives are sort of 60% back to normal, and so I can live with that.
Yeah. There was an interview that you did with Woman in Home Book Club where you said that about every 10 or 12 pages, you have to put in something to keep yourself amused as a writer. So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, because if you're amused, if you're interested, so will be the reader. But can you define for us, like, what is a something? Like, does it have to be a major plot point, or can it just be like a small little...
Well, yeah, I don't even know if that's how I put it, but I think what the point I certainly wanted to make was that if I'm bored, the reader's bored. So there has to be enough interesting stuff going on on every page that the momentum is still there. And as I try to end chapters, and my chapters kind of vary in length a bit, but they're not usually particularly too long. I try to end a chapter in such a way that doesn't have to be a big twist, but there has to be some kind of a little tweak or development or a comment that makes you sort of go, wait a minute, or a reveal or something. I like to save a reveal or anything that has any kind of significance to sort of the last couple of lines of the chapter. And so that you feel, okay, I'll read one more. And I think that goes back to being a kid of the 60s who was absolutely addicted to television. And, they always save a little something before the commercial break, a little twist or something that happens. So you think, okay, I'll go grab a snack, I'll go to the bathroom, I got to get back here. And so I always think of chapter breaks as commercial breaks. Yeah. A word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back with the next chapter.
Yeah. Do you ever find yourself going back, and I don't know what your editing process is like, but do you sometimes go back and think, I've got too much going on here, or not enough, and I've got to add something? or are you pretty good about pacing right from the get-go?
I think I'm pretty good about pacing, but I do find I write fairly quickly, and so I sometimes feel that the second draft, my own second draft, is where I sort of add a little more detail. I think, oh, I raced through that part too quickly. I need a little more here, or little more description, or a little more dialogue, something. But I do find that well, usually when I go through and do a like my books are sort of around 100,000 words, somewhere in there. I find that usually after I go through it again, it gets about 4 or 5,000 words longer because I think, oh, it just needs a little more here, a little more detail there, and so forth.
Yeah.
Uh,
So by the time you get to end of draft two, is it pretty much the book that it's going to be?
well, that depends on the book. Uh, so
Uh,
it takes me about, I would say, 2.5 to 3 months to write a first draft, and then I stop and put it aside for a week, and then I go back and spend probably another week and go through it, and then send it off to my agent and my publishers, and everything, and how much more work that I have to do on it all depends on how good that first draft is.
yeah.
I've had look both ways. This upcoming car book, I mean, there's hardly anything that's been changed from when I gave it to them. And but I've had books like The Accident and A Tap on the Window, where I just did just massive rewrites that took as long to do as the first draft. So sometimes I get lucky. Sometimes I get a book that just sort of sails through, and then I have one that's like, oh well, this one's going to be a problem. And Take Your Breath Away kind of falls in the middle because it was mostly in really good shape, but there was, and it's a long story, not to get into it, but there was one character that my editors felt was not quite right. And so I kept the character but completely changed the nature of him. And so that required a lot of little surgery. Like, he showed up for a little bit in this chapter and a little bit here and then a whole chapter, so that's where most of the work was in the rewrite of Take Your Breath Away.
Yes, no, that's a lot of work because it's not like rewriting a scene. It's you're having to revisit the entire book.
Yeah. He's everywhere this character came up. I had to redo it.
Yeah. Now you're very good, Linwood, at injecting humor into serious thrillers, and I think that's quite the skill, deciding where to put moments of levity without undercutting the tension. Now, does that happen naturally because you're a naturally funny guy? And I know you used to write a humor column, and so the humor just comes out because that's you, or do you have to work at it to make it come out that way?
I wish I could tell you that I really work at it, but I don't really think about it. Maybe I'm just kind of a smartass at heart. And so that just comes through. And I think most of the humor in the books now, the first 4 novels that I wrote were kind of comic thrillers. So they were intended, the intention was that they'd be kind of funny. Whereas the humor in all the other ones, I think, has come naturally out of sort of dialogue and banter and, cynicism and so forth. So, and that just, I don't know, it just comes out naturally. I think I put myself in the position of whoever that person is. And I think, well, what kind of glib, kind of sarcastic way are they going to respond to this? And it's just, that's just what happens.
Yeah. Do you find it easier to do it the way you're doing it now rather than writing something that's intentionally funny like the first 4?
No, I think I did the first 4 at some of the books that came sort of immediately after the first 4 were really more serious thrillers, and occasionally I would get too funny, and my agent would rein me in and said, "Look, this isn't one of your early 4 the first 4. This is a serious thriller. This scene is just a little too over the top." And so after a couple of 2 or 3 books after those first ones, I could sort of sense, this is too much. This is too far. And even in Take Your Breath Away, there's a character who I think they felt was just a hint too kind of comical, that it undercut the tension. So I just kind of reined him in a little bit.
Yeah. When you do events and you're asked to do readings, so then you have to look at your book and select what section you would like to read. And oftentimes it's at, from the beginning of the book because you don't want to give too much away. Do you find yourself leaning towards reading something that's you think is humorous, or do you tend to go for the serious side of things?
Well, sometimes I like to read the copyright page, and other times I like to read the about the author page. I think that's pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, and we've all memorized those. So
or a favorite is a note about the type. I like to read that. That's in there. But I generally really try when I go to festivals and they want you to read from the book. I just do everything I can to not do it because it's because my experience is I think listening to authors read is just the closest thing to death that there is. It's just going to be so boring. And so I don't want to put people through that. And I find that people who go to festivals, they already know how to read. And so you don't have to read it to them. They can do that. They could take it home with them and do that. And I remember being at a festival one time, this guy went up and he said, well, I have to read chapter 1 from my book. And he read chapter 1 and he had this droning, boring voice. And I don't know what he even read. It was just terrible. It was torture. And then he finally got to the end of chapter 1 and we thought, we were all praying for a meteor to strike, anything like a fire, anything at all. And finally got to the end of chapter 1 and we thought, thank God. And then he said, chapter 2. And he just kept going. And it was just, we all just wanted the world to just die, So I try not to put anybody through that.
Linwood, that was me. And this interview is over.
It was not you. It wasn't you. It was not you.
Oh, so you actually just use those opportunities just to talk about the book rather
than... I try to tell people sort of, tell them about the book and what it's about and pique their interest, I hope, about it. But to actually read, once in a while I'll do it, but I really don't. I try to avoid it at all costs. Sometimes I'll tell people, okay, I'll read from the book. And like I would do for you tonight, and I would say, okay, I'm going to read from the prologue, and I'll get to the prologue, and I'll say, okay, this will be short, but it's from the prologue. And the book starts, we can simply kill them, but there are alternatives you might want to consider. And then I think, that's it. That's all I'm going to do. And sometimes even in a reading of that length, you'll see people in the audience halfway through kind of go, how long is this going to go on? So.
Yeah. No, you have had the opportunity to write some screenplay adaptations of some of your work. And I haven't done it, but I've got to guess that maybe it's not an entire new skill set, but I think it's some new skills that you have to do that.
I dipped my toe into it. And I did write an adaptation of my book, Never Saw It Coming, for a movie that was made in Canada. And so far, it's never been seen outside of Canada. We had Emily Hampshire and Eric Robertson, and I'm very proud of it. I think Gail Harvey directed it, did a lovely job on it, I think. But it was a good experience to do it. But I've had a lot more experience for things that have never been seen. Several years ago, about 5 years ago, the director Martin Campbell, who directed, among other things, the Casino Royale, the first Daniel Craig James Bond movie.
Yeah.
He and his producer wanted to do a 6-part series based on my book, Trust Your Eyes. And they wanted me to write all the episodes. So I got flown to London and we had meetings and we went to ITV and all this sort of stuff. And I spent the next 6 months writing 12 drafts of what would have been episode 1.
Wow.
And then finally, after all that time, ITV goes, hey, I don't think we'll do it. And so I find that experience very unsatisfying. And I've also have worked on a couple of other things, a possible adaptation of my Promise Falls trilogy.
Oh.
And the actual writing of a screenplay, I love it. I just love writing them. There's no backstory, there's no inner monologue. You just write what you see and what people say, and it's really fun. And I really like it. But what I don't like is that once you're done, 85 people, they're just saying, well, I think it needs this. And I think it's not satisfying.
How did you even know how to do it? Did you go to the library and buy a How to Write a Screenplay book? Or
I watched a couple of movies, and that was helpful. I looked at what a script looks like, and I just did it.
Yeah, and you did it.
And I'm sure that could learn far more if I took a course or something, but I didn't do that.
Yeah.
And
Now that you've, sorry to interrupt, but now that you've done that, do you think it affects you when you're writing your books now, thinking that, oh, this could be a movie or a TV show? Does that at all come into play?
no,
No.
because even from the very beginning, when I'm writing a book, and this going back to dabbling in screenplay, I see a book in my head as if it were a movie. I always have. So I'm picturing it as if it's on a screen. So I've always done that. So nothing's really changed as far as since I've been doing a bit of screenplay work. I still write the way that I always have, and I'm always picturing it happening.
Yeah, yeah. For all of our attendees there, you can certainly come up with questions for Linwood. I will happily ask those on your behalf. But while we're waiting for any of those, I want to bring up something that I just love, and it's a fact.
Tell them that they can be math or geography questions. They don't have to be
very good.
But fine, please go. Sorry.
Nope. Well, we'll look for the math. And what about science? How are you with science? The thing I want to bring up quickly, though, is Stephen King has famously said about your book, Find You First. I want to read this so I get it right. It's the best book of his career. Now, that's pretty amazing. And I'm sure the day that you got that quote, there was champagne corks popping all over the place. But when the champagne's done, do you find high praise like that something that really inspires you to go out there and just top yourself again? Or do you find it to be pressure to go out there and top yourself again?
I don't think that it had that effect either way. I just thought it was just immensely gratifying.
Yeah.
Because so it wasn't pressure and it wasn't anything like that. But I've been reading Stephen King since Care. I mean, our introduction to Stephen King was when my wife and I, before we got married, we went to see the movie Carrie, and just scared us to death in that last 12 seconds of the movie. And so I've been a fan ever since. So if you were to have told me in the late 70s that Stephen King would someday be a fan of my work, I would tell you that seems unlikely. And so it just means a great deal to me. And he's very supportive of a great many authors. I mean, he's a real booster for a lot of people, and we're all grateful for it. When someone like that gives you a nod. But he's been very generous with me on a number of occasions, and I got to do an event like this with him last September. We had an hour chat for the Bloody Scotland Festival, and it was really funny. He said at the beginning, he says, "You get nervous doing these?" I said, "Only this one." And but we are back and forth occasionally on emails and so forth. And I've met him twice, and he's a very generous, very, very nice guy.
Yeah, he's a writer's writer.
Yeah.
We got a good question here from Lori. She's asking, I would love to know if Linwood makes outlines for his books, and does he make them before, during, or after the story is written?
Well, there wouldn't be much point in writing the outline after, I don't think. But what I do is I don't write a full outline. But what I do is when I think it's time to get started on a book, like, the woman pulls to the driveway, says, "Where's my house?" So I sit down, and for a couple of weeks, I'm making notes, like what could happen, who would the characters be, what's the backstory, what brought us to this moment, how would I think it would end. And I'll scribble notes for a couple of weeks, and then I'm just sick and tired of doing that. So I think I'm going to start writing it because I know at least what the first 5 chapters are. And I know where I'm going to end up. Like, I know who's done what. And so I have a broad idea of the big picture. And so I decided to start writing. So I don't have any kind of a detailed outline, but I do have the big picture in my head of who's done what. But I don't see the opportunities that, say, exist in the book or in that what I call the big mushy middle until I get into it. Yeah.
Have you ever ended up somewhere different than you thought you were going to?
A little bit. I think, and of course we really can't get into this, it'd be a spoiler, but I didn't quite see the ending coming that's in Take Your Breath Away, like the very ending, the sort of final twist. That kind of, as I was writing, I thought there was opportunity to do sort of an extra twist. Like I knew the big picture of what had happened to the woman 6 years ago. I had all that figured out. But then I did see this opportunity for something extra at the end. And I don't think I had that. I didn't have that sorted out, I think, when I started.
Okay, interesting. So a question from Nikki. Thanks, Nikki. How much input does your editor have in your writing? For example, if you really love a section and they don't, what happens?
Well, then we have to talk about it. And sometimes
is it talking or is it listening? Which and who does what?
There's, I had like for anyone who's read Find You First, there is a rather outlandishly spectacular scene right near the end. And I think if you've read it, you probably know what I'm talking about. And my editors had thought it was maybe just too over the top. And I said, there's just no way that's coming out. I thought that's the best scene in the whole book. And so I won that one. But there are other times when editors think, you know what, we don't think this is working. And so I might bristle at first, but then I listen and think, yeah, they're right. That's really annoying when the editors are right. And it's even more annoying when you rewrite the book based on what they suggested and it gets better. That's super annoying. But every book that I have done has gotten better because of working with really talented and very insightful editors. And, there are writers out there who've achieved a certain level of notoriety who say, you can't change one word. This is the book. This is it. Nothing gets changed. And I think, well, those writers, great, you can get away with that, but they lose an opportunity to make their book better. You can always make it a little better.
Yeah. A question from Alonka. Hi, Alonka. Question is, what was the seed for Find You First?
Find You First, which is about a sort of wealthy tech guy who is dying and has a huge fortune, and he's the doctor says, well, it says good thing you never had kids because there's a 50% chance that what you had would get passed on. And what the doctor doesn't know is that he was a sperm donor some 2 decades ago. So there are potentially a number of grown children out there. And he sets out to find them, in part to sort of tell them to get checked, but also who's he going to leave this vast fortune to? And I think the idea for that really came from, I think it may have been in the New York Times Magazine, but there was an article about someone who was the product of a sperm donation who went looking for half siblings, these, across the country. And it was a photo essay. And it was kind of a really human interest story. It was kind of heartwarming and interesting piece. And as a thriller writer, I looked at that and I think, how could that go horribly wrong?
Yeah.
And I think that was really sort of the jumping off point for that book. And as you mentioned earlier, there's also a character that there's a sort of that is somewhat inspired by the whole Jeffrey Epstein episode. And I saw a way to bring those two stories together. Although for a long time in the book, we're moving from one to the other and think, how on earth are these things connected? But, trust me, they will be.
Yeah. No, you did it very expertly. And as I was reading it, it just gave me shivers as I was, once I finally realized, like, wow, this is Epstein stuff. And
I'm pleased to report, I don't know how it'll go, that book has been nominated in the UK for the Ian Fleming Steel Dagger Award, as well as the Crime Writers of Canada for Best Novel, which I think is announced later this month.
Yeah.
So it's had a nice reception, that book.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, I think that would make an excellent movie. Another question here. This is interesting. What does Linwood think about taking big leaps in the timeline of a protagonist's story?
Well, I've done that before, I think, if I understand the question correctly. my breakout hit book, No Time for Goodbye, begins with this woman when she's 14 years old, and then that's our prologue, way back in the 80s or whatever, and then we jump 25 years into the future, and what she's doing now. This is a woman who's, when she's 14, they all go to bed one night, and when she wakes up in the morning, her mother, and father, and brother have vanished in the middle of the night. They're gone. She's the only one left in the house. And 25 years go by, and she's never known what happened. So if that's what we were talking about, that's a massive jump in timeline. We're going well into the future. So, and I think that's, and I mean, even in Take Your Breath Away, we jump from the prologue, we jump 6 years ahead. Yes. So, and I think that's something that, I mean, a lot of fiction does that, but I think that it's, a lot of things that we can't escape our past. So a lot of things that happen in our past come to haunt us in the future, which allows us to, jump timelines like that.
Yeah, exactly. Question, what books does Linwood like to read, and does he have time for reading? That's a good question.
I read a lot. I read a lot of books, and not just crime fiction. I'm on an Emily St. John Mandel binge. I watched Station 11 on HBO and thought it was just genius, and then saw that it was based on one of her novels. And so, but I started looking for her books, and I'm working my way up to Station 11. I read Singer's Gun a couple weeks ago, and then The Glass Hotel. And I'm now reading Station 11 and have Sea of Tranquility to get to. So she's an amazing writer. And but I'll read. I read a lot of crime fiction. I read a lot of sort of general fiction. Every once in a while, I actually read a big biography or something. I read several of the Bob Woodward Trump books and all that kind of stuff. So
when you read, are you going to bed reading kind of guy, or?
I read a lot. I read when I go to bed. I used to write kind of all day. I'd write from 8 in the morning until like 3 in the afternoon. And the last book or two, I thought, why am I killing myself? I mean, so I kind of either quit at lunch or just go back after lunch to maybe 1 o'clock or something. So I can do some reading in the afternoon. And when summer hits and, you can sit out on the deck and watch the boats go by or whatever, that's kind of my favorite time for reading, as long as I'm able to stay awake.
Yeah. Are you a quick reader? Like, do you,
Not super fast. No. I'm not, I think it's because I can, if I actually sit down and I'm committed to reading a book, I can read a book in 2-3 days probably, but it's finding large chunks of time. That's the part that's tricky for me.
Yeah, and staying awake.
I said, it's like between 2 and 3 in the afternoon reading. It's like very, very hard.
So from Kim, I like this question too. Has any story left the author changed after writing it, or can they shake off the topic and move on to the next one?
I think I'm kind of the latter. I mean, I think when I wrote my memoir, Last Resort, that had the writing of it was a bit emotional because it talked about a lot of things that were very personal to me and so forth. And but it's make believe. You know what I mean? So I haven't had a book where that sort of affected me that way. I think if anything, when you write something that you're really pleased with, there's a certain amount of satisfaction. I think I nailed it today. I think I got it. And that is not very often, because writers are their own worst critics, and we a lot of times think that everything that we do is just awful. So, but no, I can't think of a time, and I don't take myself too seriously. It's so, and what I do is as being somehow tremendously important. So I guess I just write this stuff, and then I go watch TV.
Yeah, I wonder if, because you do deal with some very serious things, but kind of going back to something we talked about earlier, the humor aspect of it. Do you think that helps your recovery time? Like if you're spending your whole day talking about, a missing wife, or, some of the tough stuff that you write about, but also if you're infusing it with a bit of humor, do you think that's part of what helps?
maybe. I think what really helps is that it is fiction and that it's something that you're inventing. It's something. I mean, there's some aspects that you take from the real world, but I think that the people who are the journalists who are covering or over in Ukraine and things like that. I mean, I think that's the kind of stuff that changes you. That of having to witness this stuff with your own eyes, these horrible things that are happening. I mean, I couldn't even pretend to think that, oh, what I write had left me sort of, damaged or upset when people are doing that kind of work.
Mhm.
I have it easy.
Will you go back to nonfiction in any sort of serious way?
No, and I really haven't. I mean, I've only done I did the one memoir, which was nonfiction. And I guess the two humor books I did, the political ones, are sort of nonfiction, but I think my skills lie in other areas, and I mean, research is just so exhausting. You know what I mean? And when I was a columnist for 14 years at the Toronto Star, and it was allegedly a humor column. And the great thing about that was you were writing satire or you were writing stuff. It was sort of whimsical stuff, and so it didn't require doing a lot of reporting, and that worked. That just worked great for me. But I mean, I spent a lot of time in the other end of journalism as an editor. I mean, I was an editor at the Toronto Star for 13, 14 years, working on the desk and sending reporters here and there, and just in the midst of chaos. And that was great fun, I have to say.
Yeah. Let's try and get one quick question in yet. We're just about done. Do you have someone to bounce ideas off of?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's my wife, Neetha. I'll sort of be maybe going for a walk and I'll say, I have some sort of idea that I'll sort of bring up with her and see what she thinks. And then I have a literary agent who's very a lot of insights in what works and what doesn't work. And when I actually finish a first draft of a book, I have a good friend that was my friend for years at Toronto Star, who lives in the city, and I'll send him. He's the only one. I'll send him a book when I've just finished it and say, "What do you think?" And he's usually pretty honest. If he says it's not quite working, I'll know it's true. Because a lot of people will just always just tell you, "Oh, it's wonderful," it's just great, and that's not very helpful if they just don't want to hurt your feelings.
Yeah.
But,
No, that makes sense to me. You have to really choose those people carefully. I, probably like you, I learned that very early on in my career because there are the people who are just going to say it's wonderful. And then there's the people that you want to say that it's wonderful. And if they say it's not, then it just, tears your world apart.
I did some interview or some written sort of interview not too long ago. And it was advice for writers. And one of the things was that when you write what you've done and you give it to your mom and your dad to read or whatever, and they tell you it's wonderful, don't believe them. What else could they say? First they're going to tell you it's fabulous. So they're not necessarily the ones that you can go to for an honest opinion because they love you.
Yeah, exactly. So what I sort of think of as, your main body of your career is, 20, 25 years. A lot of work has come out during that period. Has anything surprised you about your career, or has it gone pretty much as you thought it would or hoped it would?
I'm stunned that I have had success. The first four novels that I wrote just didn't. I'm very proud of them, but they didn't set the world on fire. I like to say that collectively they sold about 85 copies, and so when No Time for Goodbye came out in 2007, 2008, and became this massive hit. I think that book's done like in different language and so forth. It's probably done at least 3 million copies.
Yeah, so more than 85.
That was just, that was like, I just had no idea that could ever have happened. And I feel very fortunate and very lucky that it did, and that I'm able to make a living doing what I really love doing. But I could just never have predicted that was going to happen. So, I mean, when I was in my early 20s, all I wanted to be was a novelist, and I was writing novels. And for some reason, publishers didn't want to publish stuff that was bad at that time. And and then years later, 50 Shades came along, and I thought, what the hell, we don't care. And so I went into newspapers. So, well, where you can get paid money to write at a newspaper. And so things didn't go the way I'd hoped. I wanted to be a novelist right from the get-go out of university, and I didn't have my first novel published until I was, I think, 49 or something. So things didn't go the way I planned. It took a while.
Yeah. Isn't that great though? Life can surprise us in some pretty amazing ways.
Well, and I don't think I'd be nearly as I wouldn't have the skills that I have now if I hadn't spent 30 years working in newspapers.
Yeah.
That's like a crash course in the world, is working in a newspaper.
Yeah.
And so just things take the route that they take, and there's not a lot you can do about it.
Yeah. Well, Linwood, I want to thank you for spending time with us tonight in what I know is probably a very busy week for you. So appreciate you coming to Saskatchewan and spending some time with us. And I want to thank all of our guests out there. Thank you very much for those really good questions.
They're good. Those were good questions.
They were good questions.
I didn't need cheat sheets. I didn't have to do anything.
So for all of you out there, if you enjoyed this event, please don't forget to check out the Saskatchewan Festival of Words website for more information on this summer's festival, where for 4 days you get to spend time with literary talent from across Canada and me. There's going to be workshop for all ages. There's reading sessions, concerts, film, there's panel discussions, interviews, music, theater. This festival has been around for 25 years, so I think they know what they're doing. And I've been to it several times, and it's really quite a wonderful event. So everybody check out that website. Again, Linwood, thank you. It was good to see you again.
Thank you so much.
All right. Good night, everybody, and happy reading.
Okay.
Good. I'm glad. So what sort